Welcome to the Author Blurb podcast. I'm your host, Eric Maynard. So, as I've said before, I'm an author. I'm your host. I try to be as much as I can and be as entertaining as I can for you. So today's episode, I'm speaking with Dianne C. Braley. Very fun to have this conversation. I enjoy talking with her, and I think you're going to enjoy listening to her. So we're going to get into that very quickly. I'd just like to touch a few things real quick. I'd like to remind you, as always, go to authorblurb.com. You can find all the different notes, different articles, the profiles, the shows, where you can find them if you don't want to listen to them on the website. I try to provide as much as I can. Hopefully you enjoy it. Hopefully you're telling other people about the show so that they can enjoy it as well. And, excuse me, and hopefully, and you know I always have a lot of hopes, you, most of all, find that author that you really do enjoy. So, in today's conversation, Dianne and I go through and discuss her book, the fact of how she had to put a lot of herself into it. Well, she didn't have to. She chose to. And from the reviews and from listening to her, it sounds like doing so made the book a world of it made it a worldly interesting and intriguing book to read. So, listen to the conversation, enjoy it, enjoy the show, tell people, and, if you don't want to tell people, you can always rate, review, and most of all, subscribe so you don't miss any of the other episodes. Remember, we have other ones that you might have missed or you can listen to again. So, thank you, enjoy the show, and let me know what you think when you get a chance. So I'm here with Dianne C. Braley. She's an author of The Silence in the Sounds. And forgive me if I messed it up, but I think that's what we discussed it was and what you have on there.
Yeah.
Now, it's always easier, and for anybody listening to the show or watching it is going to be well aware, I prefer to let the author talk about themselves and their books first, and then we can go into the conversation. Do you mind if you start off with it and give everyone a bit of insight into yourself?
Sure. And thanks for having me. Just wanted to say that.
Well, I appreciate you being here too, by the way.
I'm really excited. And so I'm Dianne C. Braley. I am a registered nurse, first and foremost, that lives a bit north of Boston. My debut novel is The Silence in the Sound. It's a coming-of-age women's fiction novel about a young nurse that leaves her life and her family's dysfunction on the mainland behind and heads to Martha's Vineyard Island, but sometimes escaping the past isn't always as easy as it appears. And this book has been it's inspired by actual events. I was a nurse on the island for a famous Pulitzer Prize-winning author. I'm sure I hope many of you heard of him, William Styron, who arguably his best-known book was Sophie's Choice, although he's had many. And also, the premise of the book is largely, although there's all different things. You've Martha's Vineyard, a beautiful setting, toxic love, addiction, friendship, celebrity. But the premise really is about the devastating effects of growing up in addiction. Right. I'm not sure that I set out for that to be the premise, but that is the premise. And I did grow up in an alcoholic home. So there you go.
All right. So let's start off with that so I've known a few people that have grown up in a alcoholic home where it's not just the families having a beer here and there, but kind of heavy drinking, all this. And I see how some just try to avoid talking about it because it's not a real cheery topic for most people. What drove you to actually sit there and say, okay, well, this is something I need to discuss, I need to get out, or I need to have as an element in my book?
Well, interestingly enough, I I know many authors have heard this saying before. I hadn't, except my William Styron, who actually became my mentor, motivator and mentor, I think unbeknownst to him, but I told him a little bit here and there that that I used to write as a child and that I sometimes do. And it was very hard for me to say that to a genius author. And in conversation, I happened to say it and almost instantly regretted it. But he said to me, write about what you know, after I told him I was writing a story about a Virginia horse farm. And he asked me if I knew anything about Virginia or horse farms. Had I ever visited Virginia? And I said no. So that always stuck with me. And sitting there one day, I started writing, and this book, I had this story inside me for a very long time, and a lot of it was too painful to write. There's a lot of grief that I had gone through, and it took me a while. But when I started writing, I didn't realize the journey I was going down. When I started writing about Georgette, the protagonist, and her relationship with her father, I was really only going to touch on the addiction piece of that with them, but I somehow could really channel my feelings of how I felt at that age, being a young teenager and a child with an alcoholic father in a home with addiction. So I just kept writing and writing and writing, and I didn't stop. So it was very cathartic. It was very difficult, and I actually had a lot of anger at one point, because it was, write about what you know. And I'm like, well, this is what I know, addiction.
Right.
And I do know it. I don't know that I want to know it, but I know it extremely well. And I'm so happy that I was able to channel this into a book, and if it can help anyone. But again, I don't know that I sought out to do that.
Okay, so let's start with this as the next question, if you don't mind. But when I open your book, I'm on page 1. Where am I starting off with? What am I getting into from the moment I start reading your book?
Oh, so you're heading back. My book is alternating timelines, and
right.
Again, I had to change. I had to do a whole revision, because I knew that it needed to be this way after I was done with a linear.
Okay.
Of course, because that's how it goes. But you're starting out with Georgette returning to the island, her beloved island that is her whole heart, that she left and never planned on leaving. She's heading back for something that she never expected, and she doesn't want to. She has all these feelings. She's broken. She's tired. She's exhausted. And it even says, my chapter has journal entries. My chapters have journal entries, and it says, I'm exhausted from goodbyes. And she's heading back, and just never for the reason that she ever expected. And just everything has just changed.
All right. So we're stepping into her going back and all this. So give a bit of insight. So you have the alcoholic element, the addiction element in your story. This is set in Martha's Vineyard, and it sounds like there's also like not the nicest side of the community, I guess, because most people, when they think of Martha's Vineyard, they're thinking the mansions, the high end, the expensive places. I mean, it is well known for that, but I also, like any community, there's also the other people that are living in the normal houses and what so have you. What kind of community or setting in Martha's Vineyard is this taking place in?
I am so glad you brought that up. I just woke up this morning to a beautiful message from an islander, and you only get that title if you were born there.
Okay.
Which my son was. And to me, it's very special. So she said and I have heard this before. I actually had a New York Times bestselling author who's on the island say the same thing, that I did a wonderful job capturing the real working people of the island. That is really the heart and soul of the island, the belly of the island. I didn't set out to do that. I wanted to make sure I did that well. And anything I wrote about the island, I was extremely critical of myself. I wanted to really capture the island in the best way that I could from my point of view and the point of view of Georgette, who is a working person on the island, a nurse in that working class blue collar field. And I'm told that I did. And this person that sent me this message this morning also said she cringes every time she sees a book about Martha's Vineyard, because you think it's going to be this, again, mansions, this elite family, or this, beautiful rich woman, or et cetera, et cetera. Right. And again, going back to Mr. Siren's, what he said, write about what you know. And I don't know that. I at least, at the time that I was writing of my experience there, I was and still am a nurse, a working class person, surrounded by those people, struggling with the difficulties of finding housing, the expensive rents, all of those things, trying to stay in a place that I loved. The second I stepped on the sand there, I just fell in love with it and knew I was going to live there one day. But it can be extremely challenging for people there. The housing is really expensive. They're trying to do something about it now, and it's. I just hope it's not too late. It's really hard for the working people there, and that's what keeps the island going. There's a massive working class community.
Okay, so let's ask this about Georgette then. What age is she in the story? Because you said it has a linear element, but it also has regressions back into her past and thoughts and things like that. What age groups does she go through in the linear and in the regression periods?
So at the time she's on the island working for a famous author, Mr. S, living her, falling in love, having her friendships, all of this. She's in her late 20s. She's a young adult. She's in her late 20s, and then she regresses back to childhood and a lot of teenage years. There's a lot of reflection with that. And sometimes I want to say, I think sometimes some people in their later 20s are so together and right. Some aren't, I think. And I don't know that I had someone say to me, I just couldn't believe Georgette's this nurse and she just seems to have it all together and she's a professional, but she's also just she's kind of a bit of a disaster. And I'm like, well, at that age, I think a lot of people can relate right. to that. And, not all, and even sometimes even older, but yeah, that's where she was at.
All right. So what actually got you into writing? Because, and like I've mentioned on several other episodes, and the fact of other things that I've talked with other authors about, usually most people, they start writing a book and they get a fraction through it, they get to a certain point, and they just quit. They're writing a book, sounds fun, everyone loves it, but it's also a huge task to do to get through a full novel. What did you find that was your reasoning behind writing it, and what also was the driver to have you keep writing?
I started writing as I grew up in, we're going real back here. Okay. I don't know how bad, I don't want you to regret asking me the question. I grew up in a bit of a tough city north of Boston. And to me, the arts and writing and things of that nature weren't really nourished. It was really, terms like you got to put food on the table and job stability, things like that were common. And so writing was just sort of a hobby that I so enjoyed. And I started writing when I was given a journal when I was young, and I started journaling. And to me, that was, I always joke, I saw a Brady Bunch episode with Marsha Brady writing in her diary about Desi Arnaz Jr., some 70s crush, or I'm showing my age here. And I started writing, Dear Diary, blah, 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 blah. And to me, it was boring. It wasn't giving me the outlet that I needed. And ever being inspired by music, and it was the 80s at the time, so the music was just so good. I started writing lyrically, because my point in writing was I wanted to get my feelings out. I wanted to get all this out on the page of my feelings of the world and my life and in my own head. I actually just wanted to get what was I wanted to scream the thoughts in my head onto the page. So I started writing, and then I'd start writing little stories and all of that. But, that got pushed to the wayside as I got older. And my mom, who's just amazing, is a nurse, and thinking of job stability and food on the table, I went and became a nurse. Not an easy task at all.
Oh, no.
Horribly difficult, the schooling. And the idea of helping people and doing that for career really just warmed me. And I thought it was great. And it's been a very good career to me. And how funny is it that nursing led me to back, full circle as I become the nurse for this famous author, and it becomes so inspired by him and his books about, if you know Styron's work at all, it's all his books are about the darkness of himself or of the world. So I realized that I became just so inspired I could take my own darkness and put it into something, and seeing in their home with all these creators and influencers, and it just ignited something in me. I was like, I think I'm gonna do this. I think we all as writers say that I'm gonna do this, but I had to kind of go through a lot of, as I said before, some pain and grief and all of that before I could actually sit down and do this. But it's always been there. And then I'm an incredibly disciplined person. I wanted to go in the military when I was young. Arnold Schwarzenegger was massively inspiring to me. The gym, I'm not, whether you agree with his politics or not, I'm not talking about that. Just an FYI.
Oh, in the 80s and 90s, he was a fantastic actor and all this. Yeah.
Well, anything he ever did. I was a kid, not to go another way, but like I was a kid, I had a little bit of struggles with weight. And I started going to the gym, didn't know what I was doing. And I picked up his book, his bodybuilding book, and I started reading about his life and all of that. And just this immigrant comes over to this country, can't speak the language, and dominates the bodybuilding world. Then says he wants to be a movie star, becomes the biggest movie star of all time, wants to be the governor of California. Whatever he sets his mind to, he does. And I will tell you, being 18, 19 and reading about him, it was so inspiring, and it changed me. And I started becoming, I'm not going to compare myself to him, but in my own version, I became incredibly disciplined. And I took notes for years. My sister would remind me, you took notes for years and had notebooks, and you forget these things sometimes. And then one day I set a date, and I said, this is the date, and I'm starting, and I'm not stopping. And I got up every morning between 4 and 5, well, at least 5 days a week. And I wrote, didn't matter what. And I wrote for about a little over 2 years. And then I had my first draft.
Trust me, I understand. I have a 4-year-old now, and it took me, I wrote my first book before he was born. The second book finishing up just as he was born, and the third one took me close to about 2 to 3 years to write. So
Little
And
kids,
then,
it's going to take a little. My son was smaller too. It's going to take a little bit longer.
and now I have a daughter that's under a year, so writing
Oh,
comes like during lunch or early in the
oh
morning while
yeah.
they're asleep. So I understand that challenge well enough. I
Well, your
mean,
life, their life. I got up that early because if you ask my husband and son's life and my stepdaughter, their life didn't change.
right.
My life changed. I got up early, and that way I was done writing by the time he got up for school and
Hmm.
had his stuff all prepared. I don't even think they knew when I wrote this book.
Yeah, I know that's why I get up early too, is to do that. So I know it's a helpful tool, and sometimes it helps to write whenever you can. So
Yeah.
with that, what are the challenges or obstacles does Georgette tend to find, or what are some of the other characters in the book that brings the story out?
So Georgette is obviously the protagonist, and
Hmm.
then really, and it's funny when other people read your book, sometimes you're told from other people more of what your book is about than what you think it's about.
Right.
um, it's really, there's about three relationships going on in her life that are pivotal. The three male relationships that are at this at this time in her life that and at different in the time, as I said, they're different timelines. So it's her relationship with her father. She's trying to kind of figure that out and doesn't really isn't really aware of the effects of his disease of alcoholism and on her. I think she thought running away from it all was the cure, and that's sadly not the case. And she falls in love with a mysterious man, contractor, carpenter man named Doc, and his disappearing acts keep her wanting more. He feels very familiar to her. And lots of things she should see, but maybe she doesn't. She's so blinded by his just love for him, and they fall crazy in love. And at the same time, she is caring for Mr. S, this kind of melancholy, a bit grumpy, well-known author at the end of his life. And he's coming to terms with the end of his life as kind of Georgette's trying to figure out where her life is going. And he really is in the chaos that ensues. He really is her very subtle man of few words, but grounding force. He's the predictability in her life. She's not close to her family. She's alone on an island. She's going through all kinds of thoughts, feelings, in love, but this love is taking her on a path she doesn't know that she wants to go on or should go on, but can't not go on. And Mr. S is just through it all, the presence, the solid presence there, the quiet calm in the storm. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, so Mr. S is kind of the father figure, the mentor, the guiding light kind of person is what it
I
sounds
wouldn't say
like.
he's a father figure. He's a figure. He's just, in he's going through his own, he's his own as I said, coming to terms with the end of his life, but he's growing up with Georgette, and as I'm familiar with, a father that who one can love dearly, but who suffers from addiction. You don't have this presence that is needed. You don't have the solid safety, this predictability. Sometimes you just never know what you're walking into. So just even to have that, her job in caring for him, this steadfast everyday job in caring for this man, and them together more than she's ever been with anybody. 7 days a week, just constantly, and they almost are seemingly codependent on each other, and she needs him and he needs her, and I'm not even sure she realizes it, but he's there, and a male presence that I don't know that she's ever had in any way that's predictable and safe.
Okay. So when you wrote it, who did you did you have an audience in mind, a set of people in mind that you were writing it for, or did you just kind of push it out and see what came out?
I think I mean, I definitely pushed it out and saw what came out, but as it took shape, I 100% started seeing that this book could really help people. As I started getting feedback from beta readers, and and I saw that I have an ability, and I do have an ability because I have sought help. My mother had us in Children of Alcoholics when we were young. I have been in Al-Anon. I have been in therapy. I have been in everything.
Right.
And I was able, though, at a very young age, thankfully, and sometimes I think it's all about the age. My father passed away when I was 18. Him and I had a bit of a tumultuous relationship, and I told it like it was. I got tough real young, real fast, and I didn't put up with anything. And that was my way of dealing with it. It was, obviously toughness is usually masking some other things, but
Right.
I was able, though, to see him as a human, and you'll see that in the book. There's a point I saw him, luckily, before he passed, and through some help, I was able to see him as not just my father, because I think so many of us, even at God, as we're adults, sometimes we just think our parents are just our parents. They're not people. My mom is my mom, my dad is my dad, and they exist for me.
Right.
And you have these little glimmers of, like, they've had their own past, they've had their own problems, they come from families that, all these things. And I don't, especially when you're young, I'm not sure you see that. And I was able to see my father as not just an addict, not just an alcoholic, and he was a low bottom alcoholic. I saw him as a man that struggled so much, wanted to be different, that was caring, that helped people, that really was kind, all these things. But, would I want to be married to someone like that? Did I want to live with him? Oh, no, but I could see him as a human being. And so many people who have read this book have told me, even if their parents aren't addicts, I think we all, not all, but a lot of us have sometimes some issues with our parents in some way, shape, or form. And a lot of people have said to me that they could see, empathy, and they could see their parents as human, and start looking at things a bit differently. So I did see that would come out of the book a little bit. And I because I think addicts sometimes, I'm sorry, I'm rambling.
Oh, you're fine.
Addicts are portrayed often in books and movies and things like that as just addicts. Like, they're just an addict. It's bad. It's, there's, not we're not just one-dimensional people. There's all kinds of dimensions and depths to people. And, you don't have to put up with it, and you don't have to, it doesn't, you can detach with love, but there is a human being there. And I think it's really important to recognize that.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I mean, you do tend to see most addicts in books being strictly the villains, or you're not really getting to see the good side or the opposite side of them, because you see the bad things that they tend to do more than anything else. And in truth, that's how a lot of people see addicts in the real life as well, I believe, because I know, I say it, I have that same view of when you see somebody that's on drugs, and you don't personally know them, first thing you're thinking is, what are they going to do? What do I need to worry about? You don't think, what suffer are they going through? What can we do to help them? So I understand that. I mean, there's a lot of challenges and a lot of things to even get over that mindset. And I don't see it coming anytime soon, but in time it might. But it's still good to see some people in the light of, hey, I'm a good person, I just need to get through this challenge or I have this issue. And it sounds like you address that very openly and very forthcoming in your book. So,
and in my experience as being a nurse too, I just see so many different paths to addiction that aren't necessarily what one person thinks. A lot of people have come into addiction that didn't, seek out drugs. Some, some had surgery, some were prescribed by a doctor, were following instructions, things like that. And that's happened more and more. And I definitely just want to say as much as I think that is such an important piece of my book, showing the humanness in people who are suffering from addiction, my main premise, my main goal, my heart is for the children of addiction. Addicts get a lot of funding and a lot of awareness, not enough by any means, but to me, the children are just the unheard voices, and they have such more of a likelihood to be addicts themselves or people of dysfunction. And it's such a taboo subject. We don't talk about it. It's shameful, and they think it's them, all these problems. And if there just needs to be so much more education for these kids. And that is my number one goal in this book. I've partnered with the Robert F. Kennedy Community Alliance organization in Boston and their division that helps kids affected by addiction. And they do a ton of great work. And to me, that is where my heart is.
All right. And that makes sense too, because like you said, you went through it, and having that understanding of it as a child of it. So not, if it sounds too personal, you can tell me you don't want to talk about it, but
I'm fine.
What is, as a child of addiction, and like you said, it is easy to get into addiction. And like I said, I've known people who have been raised by addicts and things like that, alcoholics, different things, and they tend to be maybe not as bad, or sometimes I've seen them go even worse, but they tend to have a huge draw to using substances of some sort to feel better. Now, what do you address ways to kind of in the storyline to avoid getting into that trap?
You'll see Georgette, and I think a lot of us take the addiction aside. I think a lot of us are growing, as we grow up, we go through periods where we want nothing. We want to be nothing like our parents. We're like, oh God, no. Oh God.
Right.
And then you start seeing little glimmers as you age, like, oh, that's like my dad. Oh, that's like my mom. And some of it's good, some of it's bad, and some of it you're pleased with, and some of it you're like, oh God, no. And Georgette definitely goes through that, and she sees a pattern of things, and then she sees a bit of her dad and all these things. And you'll definitely see that at the, she's going to come out. It might not be the ending, I think. Well, I shouldn't speak too much, but yeah, but I think sometimes people, they want a certain story, a giant, big, happy ending. I definitely believe when I write, I think there needs to be some closure, unless there's going to be a sequel.
Right.
But you'll definitely see a little bit of touching on that she's maybe doing a little bit of what it takes to heal.
All right. So, and then now, like you mentioned, sequels or continuing on, is this going to be a standalone where there's no other stories coming after or prequels of it? Is there another series to it, addition, or is this going to be by itself?
Someone said that to me. They'd like to see a sequel, and I'm like, oh God, really? Because I'm telling you, I don't know that as I said, this book was very, very emotional for me. It was difficult, and I can do it, but I think it's a standalone for now. I'm well into another book that I wasn't intending on writing. I had another book I was writing, and then something happened in our lives, me and my husband. It kind of we something. Another dark kind of story happened, not really touching us massively directly. Well, me, I should say, but this story was just fascinating to me, and I've been listening to trials, and I've been doing, and I'm like, I have to write this story from a perspective of that most people don't. I'm sorry, I'm kind of teasing you here, so fine. I'm well into this book, and I definitely need to see it through. So I don't know if I'll ever go back with the silence and the sound, or what I'll do with that. Maybe someday. You never know.
Understand. So, what your next book? Do you have a estimation of when it's going to be coming out, or do you have a timeline you're trying to hit with this?
I think because it's not so personal to me, I'm finding it easier to write, and I'm getting it from a lot of factual things and different. So I'm finding it easier to write. I'm not so emotionally attached to it. So, but I'm a faster writer now, but with all the marketing you do for a book, which I'm currently just drowning in happily, but I haven't had any time to write at all. Sorry, my husband's radio is going off. He's a fireman. He's an on-call fireman, and I should have turned that down. Yeah, I'm hoping for a year.
Okay, so people have something to look forward to keep reading about you, because I know, like I said, the reviews in your first book, in The Silence and the Sound, is all wonderful, great little reviews that people put on there that makes the book sound like it's almost a must read in a way. So I found that very interesting. You usually see, because you have, I think, 29 reviews on that book right now, and no one has a bad thing to say, which is fantastic. So I do appreciate you being on. I don't want to take up overly too much of your time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remind everyone that there is a profile of you on authorblurb.com where all your links, the information you've given me, is there for them to find you. So where do you prefer people to go and find you if they don't want to go to authorblurb.com?
You can find me on my website, www.diannecbraley.com, or Twitter, Dianne Braley, Instagram, Dianne C. Braley, Facebook, Dianne C. Braley, LinkedIn, God, everywhere. Dianne C. Braley, Dianne C. Braley. And sign up for my newsletter on my website, please.
Well, it's always good. That way people can keep track of you if they do the newsletter, just like I tell people, or at least I try to remind them to sign up for the newsletter for this show. So, again, I appreciate you being on. This is going to be the end of the conversation for everybody else. But if you can hold on.
Thank you, Eric.